When my daughter-in-law slid that frozen dinner across the counter to me while she plated prime rib for everyone else, I smiled and said thank you. When my son watched it happen and said nothing, I nodded quietly. But when I found the legal documents, in my own desk drawer 3 weeks later, everything changed. Sometimes the kindest grandmother has to become the smartest landlord. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Stephanie Clarke, and at 71 years old, I thought I had seen every kind of family drama this side of the Mississippi River could serve up. I was wrong. I lived in Meridian, Mississippi, in a house that had been in our family for 3 generations, where the magnolia trees bloomed white as wedding dresses every spring and the summer heat hung thick enough to swim through. This wasn't just any house, mind you. It was the kind of place that anchored a family, the kind that held memories in its walls and stories in its creaking floorboards. I had been a widow for 8 years, ever since my Harold passed from a heart attack that took him quick and merciful on a Tuesday morning while he was feeding the chickens. We had built a good life together in that house, raised our son Michael there, watched him take his first steps across that very kitchen floor, helped him with homework at the dining room table that had belonged to Harold's grandmother. The house held all of it, every birthday party, every Christmas morning, every graduation celebration. It was more than brick and mortar. It was home. For the past 43 years, I had worked as a secretary at the county courthouse, filing documents, answering phones, helping folks navigate the maze of permits and licenses and legal paperwork that keeps a community running. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was steady, and it taught me things. Important things. Things about property law and tenant rights and how signatures on official documents could change everything. I retired 5 years ago with a decent pension and a mind still, sharp enough to balance my checkbook to the penny and remember every birthday in the family without writing them down. My son Michael had married Jennifer 3 years back, a pretty young woman from Jackson who worked in marketing for some big company I could never quite keep track of. She had opinions about everything, from the color of our kitchen walls to the brand of coffee I bought, and she wasn't shy about sharing them. They lived in a modern subdivision about 20 minutes away, one of those neighborhoods where all the houses looked like they came from the same catalog and the homeowners association sent you letters if your grass grew too tall. It was fine for them, I supposed, but it never felt like home to me when I visited. After Michael's wedding, they started coming around more often, especially for Sunday dinners and holidays. Jennifer would arrive with store-bought desserts and complaints about the drive, settling into my living room like she was doing me a favor by being there. She had a way of rearranging things without asking, moving my throw pillows to what she called more flattering positions, and suggesting I might want to update my wallpaper to something more contemporary. I learned to bite my tongue and focus on the joy of having my son back at the family table, even if the dynamics had shifted in ways I couldn't quite name. The house itself was a sprawling 2-story Victorian with 4 bedrooms, 2.5 bathrooms, a wraparound porch, and enough space to host a church potluck if you moved the furniture around right. Harold and I had restored it room by room over the years, stripping wallpaper and refinishing hardwood floors, and updating the plumbing when we could afford it. Every improvement was done with love and intention, every choice made to honor the house's history while making it livable. For a modern family, it was probably worth more than I wanted to think about, sitting on 2 acres of prime real estate just far enough from downtown to feel peaceful but close enough to walk to the grocery store when the weather was nice. I kept a garden out back, where I grew tomatoes and green beans and enough okra to share with half the neighborhood. The kitchen was my favorite room, spacious and bright with windows that looked out over the garden and countertops that had seen thousands of meals prepared. With care, I had cooked for church functions and family gatherings and neighbors going through hard times for more years than I could count. Food was love in our family, the way we showed care, the way we celebrated and mourned and connected with each other. My daily routine was comfortable and predictable in the best possible way. I woke up early, made coffee in the same pot I had used for 20 years, and read the newspaper cover to cover while the morning light filtered through the kitchen curtains. I tended my garden, ran errands around town, visited with friends, and usually had something simmering on the stove by late afternoon. Evenings were for reading or watching the news or calling my sister in Biloxi to catch up on family gossip. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It was a quiet life, but it was mine, earned through decades of hard work and carefully managed finances. I had been blessed with good health and a sharp mind, still driving myself wherever I needed to go and managing all my own affairs without help from anyone. Independence was important to me, perhaps more important than it should have been, but I had seen too many elderly folks lose control of their lives bit by bit until they were strangers in their own homes. I was determined not to let that happen to me. I paid my bills on time, kept my house clean and well-maintained, and made sure my legal documents were always in order. Harold had taught me that preparation was the best protection against life's uncertainties. The first signs of trouble started subtly, the way these things usually do. Michael and Jennifer began dropping by more frequently, often without calling first, which struck me as odd since Jennifer was usually so particular about planning everything in advance. They would walk through the house with what they called casual interest, commenting on the crown molding and the original hardwood floors and the way the afternoon light hit the dining room just right. Jennifer would take pictures sometimes, claiming she wanted to remember how beautiful everything looked, but something about the way she framed the shots made me uneasy. During these visits, they started asking questions about my finances, disguised as concern for my well-being. Michael would wonder aloud whether I was finding it difficult to maintain such a large house on a fixed income, and Jennifer would suggest that maybe I should consider downsizing to something more manageable. They talked about retirement communities with activities and built-in social networks, places where I wouldn't have to worry about yard work or home repairs, or the isolation that comes with living alone in a big house. I appreciated their concern. I truly did. But I also felt the underlying assumption that I was somehow incapable of making these decisions for myself. When I assured them that I was managing just fine, that the house was paid off and my pension covered all my expenses with room to spare, they would exchange glances that made me feel like a child being humored by patient adults. It was subtle enough that I couldn't call them on it directly, but persistent enough that it began to wear on my nerves. The Sunday dinners continued, but the atmosphere started to change in ways I couldn't quite put my finger on. Jennifer would arrive with specific dietary requests and concerns about sodium content and organic ingredients, turning my simple family meals into complicated negotiations about what was healthy and what was outdated. She brought her own salad dressing and questioned whether my green beans had been cooked too long and suggested that maybe we should all be eating more fish and less red meat. I tried to accommodate her preferences without letting it change the fundamental character of our family gatherings, but it became harder and harder to find middle ground. What had once been relaxed conversations around the dinner table became tense discussions about nutrition and lifestyle choices, and the importance of staying current with health trends. I found myself walking on eggshells in my own dining room, second-guessing recipes that had been family favorites for generations. Michael seemed caught between his loyalty to me and his desire to keep peace with his wife, which I understood but found increasingly frustrating. He would nod along with Jennifer's suggestions about updating my cooking methods or simplifying my meal planning, but when it was just the two of us, he would tell me how much he missed the big Sunday spreads I used to make when he was growing up. The contradiction was painful for both of us, but neither of us seemed to know how to address it directly. The house itself became a source of ongoing tension, though it took me a while to recognize the pattern. Jennifer would comment on how much work it must be to keep everything clean and organized, how overwhelming it must feel to have so many rooms that rarely got used. She would point out minor maintenance issues that I hadn't noticed or hadn't prioritized, suggesting that perhaps they were signs of larger problems that required professional attention. Every conversation seemed designed to plant seeds of doubt about my ability to manage my own home. I began to feel defensive about choices that had never required justification before, like why I kept Harold's study exactly as he had left it, or why I didn't want to replace the original windows with more energy-efficient models. These weren't signs of decline or stubbornness. They were deliberate decisions about how I wanted to live in my own space. But suddenly everything was subject to scrutiny and gentle correction. It was exhausting in a way I had never experienced before. The breaking point was still weeks away, but the foundation was being laid with every visit, every suggestion, every pointed observation about my living situation. I was beginning to feel like a guest in my own home, constantly aware that my choices were being evaluated and found wanting by people who had never had to maintain a family legacy or honor the memory of a beloved spouse through the preservation of shared spaces. The irony was that in trying to help me, they were systematically undermining the very independence they claimed to be concerned about protecting. But I was still Stephanie Clarke, still the woman who had managed a courthouse office for 4 decades and raised a son and maintained a Victorian house through good times and bad. I might have been getting older, but I wasn't getting weaker, and I certainly wasn't getting foolish. The lessons I had learned about legal documents and property rights were still sharp in my mind, waiting for the right moment to remind everyone exactly who owned what in this particular family drama. That moment was coming sooner than any of us expected. The shift from subtle suggestions to outright disrespect happened so gradually that I almost missed it entirely. Looking back, I can see the progression now, how each small transgression prepared the ground for the next. How my son and his wife tested my boundaries like children, seeing how far they could push before someone finally said no. But at the time, I was still operating under the assumption that we were family, that love and respect were givens that didn't require negotiation or enforcement. It started with the way Jennifer began treating my home like her personal project. She would arrive for our Sunday dinners with fabric samples and paint chips, spreading them across my coffee table while explaining how certain colors would make the rooms feel more spacious and modern. She brought interior design magazines and bookmarked pages showing before and after transformations of homes similar to mine, pointing out how much brighter and more welcoming everything looked after the updates. These weren't casual suggestions anymore. They were presentations, complete with cost estimates and timelines and recommendations for contractors she had researched online. Michael would sit quietly during these sessions, occasionally nodding when Jennifer looked to him for support, but never quite meeting my eyes when I tried to gauge his real feelings about these proposed changes. I began to suspect that these conversations had been rehearsed, that they had discussed strategies for convincing me to modernize the house before they ever set foot in my living room. The realization that I was being managed rather than consulted felt like a small betrayal, the kind that stings more because it comes from people you trust. The discussions about my living situation became more frequent and more pointed. Jennifer would mention news stories about elderly people who had fallen in their homes and gone undiscovered for days, or share articles about the benefits of senior communities where professional staff could monitor residents and provide assistance as needed. She painted pictures of social activities and organized outings and the peace of mind that comes with knowing help is always available. When I pointed out that I had neighbors and friends and a community of people who checked on me regularly, she would smile and nod, but then pivot to talking about how much work it must be to coordinate all that informal support. The financial pressure began around the same time, though it was dressed up as helpful advice about maximizing my retirement income. Jennifer had done research on the real estate market in our area and discovered that houses like mine were in high demand among young families looking for character and history. She brought printouts showing comparable sales and estimated values, explaining how much equity I was sitting on that could be converted into investment income if I were willing to sell. The numbers were impressive, I had to admit, but they felt abstract and irrelevant when weighed against the intangible value of staying in the home where I had built my life. Michael started contributing to these conversations in ways that hurt more than Jennifer's obvious campaign. He would share memories of growing up in the house, but frame them as reasons why it might be time for someone else to make new memories. There. He talked about how much work his father and I had put into maintaining the property, suggesting that maybe I deserved a break from all that responsibility. He reminisced about family gatherings and holidays, but wondered aloud whether those traditions might translate just as well to a smaller, more manageable space. The most painful part was how he positioned these suggestions as being in my best interest, as if the idea of leaving my home was something I should welcome rather than resist. He talked about reducing my stress and simplifying my life and freeing me up to pursue new interests and adventures. Every conversation ended with assurances that they only wanted me to be happy and healthy and safe, as if my current living situation was somehow threatening all three of those things. I tried to explain that the house wasn't just a building. To me, that it held Harold's presence in ways that couldn't be packed up and moved to a retirement community. I told them about the morning rituals that connected me to my husband's memory, the way the light fell across his empty coffee cup on the kitchen table, the comfort I found in sleeping in the bedroom we had shared for more than 40 years. But these explanations seemed to reinforce their belief that I was clinging to the past in unhealthy ways, that I needed help letting go and moving forward. The visiting pattern changed sometime in late spring. Instead of calling ahead and asking if it was convenient to stop by, Michael and Jennifer began showing up unannounced, usually on weekday afternoons when they knew I would be home. They would let themselves in through the back door, calling out cheerful greetings as they made their way through the house. Jennifer explained that they didn't want to bother me with phone calls for such casual visits, that they considered themselves family enough to drop by whenever the mood struck them. These impromptu visits felt different from our planned Sunday dinners. There was an urgency to them that I couldn't quite identify, a sense that they were on some kind of mission that didn't include me as a participant. They would walk through the rooms with new eyes, pointing out things that needed attention or repair, discussing changes that would improve the functionality or appearance of various spaces. Jennifer would take notes in a small leather notebook, jotting down measurements and observations and ideas for improvements. I started feeling like a stranger in my own home during these visits. They would settle into conversations about the house that assumed decisions I had never agreed to make, discussing tile options for the guest bathroom or debating whether the dining room would look better with different window treatments. When I tried to redirect these conversations or remind them that no renovations were planned, they would laugh and say they were just brainstorming, just having fun imagining possibilities. But their enthusiasm felt aggressive, like they were willing my resistance to crumble through sheer persistence. The dynamic at our Sunday dinners shifted as well, though the changes were so subtle that I questioned my own perceptions. Jennifer started bringing more elaborate dishes, complete meals that she would arrange on my dining room table, while relegating my contributions to side dish status. She would praise my green bean casserole or cornbread while serving entrees. That required no input from me, effectively turning me into a guest at my own table. The irony wasn't lost on me, but pointing it out seemed petty and ungrateful. Michael's role in these new arrangements was harder to define, but equally troubling. He would compliment both his wife's cooking and mine with equal enthusiasm, as if he couldn't see the power shift happening right in front of him. When Jennifer would gently correct my table setting or suggest better ways to serve certain dishes, he would nod approvingly and thank her for helping make everything perfect. I found myself biting my tongue more and more often, swallowing responses. That felt too harsh or defensive for a family dinner. The conversations during these meals became increasingly focused on practical matters rather than personal connection. Jennifer would update us on her research into senior living options, sharing brochures and testimonials from satisfied residents who had made the transition from independent living to assisted communities. She had visited several facilities in the area and could describe their amenities and services in detail, painting pictures of active, engaged lifestyles that made my current routine sound isolated and limited by comparison. Michael would contribute stories about colleagues whose parents had made similar transitions, always emphasizing how much happier and healthier they seemed once they had professional support and structured social activities. These anecdotes felt carefully chosen to reinforce Jennifer's arguments, though I couldn't prove that they had coordinated their approach. The cumulative effect was a weekly barrage of evidence that people like me were better off in places designed specifically for our needs and limitations. I began to dread these Sunday gatherings, though I couldn't bring myself to cancel them or suggest that we meet less frequently. Michael was my only child, and despite my growing frustration with the direction our relationship was taking, I wasn't ready to sacrifice the time we spent together. I kept hoping that the pressure would ease, that they would realize I was capable of making my own decisions about my living situation and respect my choice to stay in my home. The financial discussions became more aggressive as summer progressed. Jennifer brought a real estate agent to one of our Sunday dinners, introducing her as a friend who happened to work in property sales and might have some insights about the current market. The agent was polite and professional, complimenting the house's original features and architectural details while identifying opportunities for updates that would maximize its appeal to potential buyers. She left a business card and a market analysis showing recent sales in our neighborhood, along with an estimate of what my house might bring in the current market. I felt ambushed by this presentation, though Jennifer insisted it was just informal conversation among friends. The agent's presence at our family dinner felt like a violation of boundaries I hadn't known needed to be stated explicitly. Michael seemed as surprised as I was by the visit, but he didn't ask his wife why she had invited a real estate professional to our meal without discussing it with either of us first. His silence felt like complicity, even if it was just conflict, avoidance. The breaking point arrived on a sweltering Sunday in August, one of those Mississippi afternoons when the air conditioning struggles against the heat and even the shade offers little relief from the oppressive humidity. I had prepared a simple dinner of fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and fresh corn from my garden, nothing fancy but filling and comfortable for such weather. Jennifer arrived carrying bags from an expensive grocery store downtown, unpacking ingredients for what she described as a lighter, more seasonal meal that would be easier on our digestion. I watched her take over my kitchen with practiced efficiency, rearranging my counter space to accommodate her preparations and relegating my already cooked chicken to the refrigerator for another time. She explained that heavy fried foods weren't appropriate for such hot weather, that older people especially needed to be mindful of how rich meals could affect their energy levels and overall well-being. Michael nodded along with these pronouncements, apparently having forgotten that he had grown up eating my Sunday dinners in weather just as hot without any apparent damage to his health or energy. The meal Jennifer prepared was undeniably beautiful, a colorful salad with grilled vegetables and some kind of fish I didn't recognize, presented on plates that showcased the vibrant ingredients like artwork. It was the kind of food you might order at an upscale restaurant, sophisticated and carefully composed and completely unlike anything I would have chosen to serve in my own home. She had brought wine to accompany the meal, a crisp white variety that she said would complement the delicate flavors better than the sweet tea I had prepared. As we sat down to eat, Jennifer served Michael and herself generous portions of the elaborate salad and grilled fish, arranging everything on their plates with the same attention to presentation she had shown in the kitchen. Then she turned to me with an apologetic smile and explained that she had brought something special for me, something that would be easier for me to manage and digest. She disappeared into the kitchen and returned with a microwave dinner, still in its cardboard container, the kind of frozen meal you might grab from the grocery store when you're too tired or busy to cook. The package featured a picture of Salisbury steak with gravy, mashed potatoes, and green beans, processed foods designed to look homemade but obviously mass-produced and preserved for shelf stability. Jennifer placed it in front of me with the same care she had shown in plating the fresh meal for herself and Michael, explaining that she had chosen this particular brand because it was specifically formulated for seniors, with reduced sodium and portion control built right in. She suggested that these convenient options might be perfect for my daily meals, eliminating the need for cooking and cleanup while ensuring proper nutrition. I stared at the frozen dinner, still slightly cold in the center despite the microwave heating, and felt something fundamental shift inside me. This wasn't concern for my well-being or helpful advice about managing my household more efficiently. This was a statement about my place in my own family, a demonstration of how they saw me and what they believed I deserved. While they enjoyed fresh fish and carefully prepared vegetables, I was being fed processed food from a package, as if my palate and preferences and basic dignity were no longer worthy of consideration. Michael said nothing as I picked at the rubbery Salisbury steak and artificially flavored vegetables. He ate his elegant meal and complimented Jennifer on the seasoning and presentation, discussing the quality of the fish and the perfect balance of the vinaigrette. They talked around me rather than to me, as if I were a child who should be grateful for whatever food was put in front of me without expecting to participate in adult conversation about flavor and preparation and enjoyment. I finished what I could of the frozen dinner and excused myself to clear the table, but Jennifer insisted that she would handle the cleanup since she had done the cooking. I watched from the doorway as she scraped my barely touched meal into the garbage disposal and loaded her dishes into my dishwasher, moving through my kitchen with the confidence of someone who belonged there more than I did. Michael helped by putting away ingredients and wiping down surfaces, both of them working together to restore order to my space according to their standards and preferences. That night, after they had left with promises to call soon and reminders about the real estate information they had left on my coffee table, I sat alone in my kitchen and tried to process what had happened. The frozen dinner had been more than an insult to my cooking or my capacity to feed myself. It had been a preview of the future they were planning for me, a life where my choices and preferences would be managed by other people who knew better than I did what was appropriate for someone my age. I thought about the contrast between their fresh, carefully prepared meal and the processed food they had deemed suitable for me. And I realized that this wasn't really about nutrition or convenience, or concern for my well-being. This was about power and control, and the assumption that age automatically disqualified me from making decisions about my own life. They were treating me like someone who needed to be managed rather than respected, someone whose opinions and desires were less important than their plans for my future. The real estate papers Jennifer had left behind sat on my coffee table like a challenge, glossy brochures for retirement communities mixed with market analyses and property valuations. I picked up the folder and carried it to Harold's study, where I kept important documents in the same filing cabinet he had used for his business papers. As I opened the drawer to put the real estate information away, my fingers brushed against a folder I hadn't touched in months, one labeled with my maiden name and containing papers I had almost forgotten existed. Inside that folder were the original property deeds and transfer documents from when Harold and I had inherited the house from his parents, along with all the subsequent paperwork related to improvements and refinancing over the years. But there were other documents as well, papers I had filed away without thinking much about their significance at the time. Rental agreements and lease modifications and eviction notices from the small apartment we had maintained above the detached garage, the income property that had helped us pay for renovations and improvements to the main house. Michael and Jennifer had been living in that apartment for the past 6 months, ever since Jennifer's company had relocated their regional office to Meridian, and they had decided it made financial sense to move closer to her work. They were paying rent that was significantly below market rate, a family discount I had offered because I wanted to help them save money for their future. The lease agreement was clear and legal and binding, signed by all parties and properly notarized according to the requirements I had learned during my years working at the courthouse. As I read through the terms of their lease, a plan began to form in my mind, not born of anger or revenge, but of simple recognition that respect is a two-way street and that dignity isn't something you lose automatically when you reach a certain age. They wanted to treat me like someone whose opinions and preferences didn't matter, someone who could be fed frozen dinners while they enjoyed fresh meals, someone whose home could be redesigned and sold according to their timeline and priorities. But they had forgotten one crucial detail in their calculations about my diminished capacity and limited options. I wasn't just their aging relative who needed to be managed and protected from her own poor judgment. I was their landlord, and landlords have rights and options that tenants sometimes forget to consider when they're making assumptions about power and control. The lease agreement in my hands represented more than just a legal document. It was a reminder that some relationships are defined by law rather than sentiment, and that contracts don't care about family dynamics or good intentions or assumptions about who deserves what kind of treatment. I spent the rest of that evening reading through every document in the folder, refreshing my memory about the specific terms and conditions that governed their tenancy, the obligations and expectations that applied to both parties regardless of our family relationship. By the time I went to bed, I had a clear understanding of exactly what options were available to me, and I had made a decision about how I wanted to proceed. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of reminding my son and his wife that respect and dignity aren't privileges that disappear with age, and that some lessons can only be learned through consequences rather than conversation. Monday morning arrived with the kind of clarity that only comes after a sleepless night spent making difficult decisions. I had tossed and turned until dawn, not from uncertainty about what I needed to do, but from the weight of understanding that some bridges once crossed changed the landscape forever. The documents spread across Harold's desk had given me more than legal options. They had given me back my voice, my agency, my power to choose how I would be treated in my own home and by my own family. I dressed carefully that morning, choosing a navy blue suit I hadn't worn since my retirement party, the kind of outfit that commanded respect in professional settings. I fixed my hair and applied lipstick with the same precision I had used for 43 years of courthouse mornings, armor disguised as routine grooming. Today wasn't about being the accommodating grandmother who swallowed insults for the sake of family harmony. Today was about being Stephanie Clarke, property owner and businesswoman, someone who understood contracts and consequences and the importance of following proper procedures. My first stop was the county courthouse, the building, where I had spent most of my working life and where I still knew every clerk and supervisor by name. Walking through those familiar hallways felt like stepping back into a version of myself I had almost forgotten existed, the competent professional who solved problems and navigated complex situations with confidence and skill. The smell of old files and copy machine toner was oddly comforting, a reminder that I had once been indispensable in this world of legal documents and official procedures. I spent 2 hours in the records office, reviewing tenant-landlord law and refreshing my memory about eviction procedures, notice requirements, and the specific protections available to property owners in Mississippi. The current clerk, a young woman named Patricia who had been hired just before my retirement, was eager to help and impressed by my thorough understanding of the filing system. She pulled relevant statutes and recent case law, explaining how certain procedures had been updated in the years since I had left the courthouse. The information I gathered was both encouraging and sobering. Mississippi law provided clear protections for landlords dealing with problematic tenants, but the procedures required careful attention to detail and specific timelines that couldn't be rushed or improvised. Every notice had to be properly formatted and delivered according to precise requirements. Every deadline had to be documented and verified. Every step in the process had to be completed exactly as specified in the statutes, or the entire proceeding could be invalidated. I took detailed notes in a small spiral notebook, recording the specific language required for different types of notices, the timeframes for tenant responses, and the documentation needed to support various grounds for eviction. The process was more complex than I had remembered, but not impossibly so, especially for someone with my experience in legal procedures and record-keeping. I felt a familiar satisfaction in mastering the details, in understanding exactly what needed to be done and how to do it correctly. From the courthouse, I drove to the law office of James Crawford, an attorney who had handled Harold's estate and who I trusted to provide honest advice about my situation. James had known our family for years and had always treated me with the kind of respect that seemed to be disappearing from my current family relationships. His office was in one of the restored Victorian houses downtown, with high ceilings and original hardwood floors that reminded me of my own home's character and history. James listened carefully as I explained the situation, taking notes while I described the escalating pressure to sell my house, the disrespectful treatment I had been receiving, and the lease agreement that governed Michael and Jennifer's tenancy in my garage apartment. He asked thoughtful questions about their behavior, the specific terms of their rental arrangement, and my goals for addressing the situation. There was no judgment in his voice, no suggestion that I should simply endure poor treatment for the sake of family peace. His legal advice was straightforward and reassuring. The lease agreement was solid and enforceable, with clear terms that protected my rights as a landlord, while establishing reasonable expectations for my tenants. If I chose to terminate their tenancy, I would need to provide proper notice according to the terms specified in their lease, which required 60 days written notification delivered in accordance with Mississippi law. The grounds for termination didn't require proof of wrongdoing. Month-to-month arrangements could be ended by either party with appropriate notice. James also reviewed the language in their lease regarding property modifications and guest policies, pointing out several violations that had occurred without my written consent. Jennifer's real estate agent friend had been conducting business on my property without permission, which constituted a breach of the lease terms prohibiting commercial activities in the residential unit. Their pattern of unannounced visits and unauthorized access to the main house could also be considered violations of the privacy provisions in their rental agreement. The attorney's fees for preparing the necessary legal documents would be minimal, especially since I was familiar with the required procedures and could handle much of the administrative work myself. James offered to review any notices or correspondence before I sent them, ensuring that everything was properly formatted and legally sound. He also suggested that I document all interactions with my tenants going forward, creating a paper trail that would support any future legal actions if they became necessary. Armed with legal knowledge and professional support, I drove home feeling more empowered than I had in months. The house looked different to me now, not just as the family home where I had lived for decades, but as a valuable property that I owned and controlled according to legally binding agreements. The garage apartment where Michael and Jennifer lived wasn't a favor I was doing for family. It was a business arrangement with rights and responsibilities on both sides. I spent the afternoon in Harold's study, drafting the first of what would be several carefully worded documents. The 60-day notice to terminate tenancy was surprisingly straightforward, requiring only basic information about the property, the tenants, and the legal grounds for ending their lease. I used language directly from the statute books, ensuring that every phrase and deadline was precisely correct. The notice was formal and businesslike, acknowledging our family relationship while making clear that this was a landlord-tenant matter governed by law rather than sentiment. I also prepared a separate letter documenting the lease violations I had observed, including the unauthorized commercial activity and the pattern of accessing areas of my property that weren't included in their rental agreement. This letter served multiple purposes. It created an official record of their behavior. It demonstrated that I was monitoring compliance with lease terms, and it established grounds for immediate termination if they chose to contest the 60-day notice. The process of writing these documents was strangely therapeutic, transforming my frustration and hurt into concrete legal action that would produce real consequences. For too long, I had been responding to their disrespect with silence and accommodation, hoping that kindness would eventually be reciprocated. Now I was responding with the same kind of systematic planning and professional competence that had made me successful in my courthouse career. I called Patricia at the records office to schedule an appointment for notarizing the documents, ensuring that everything would be properly witnessed and sealed according to legal requirements. I also contacted a process server James had recommended, a retired sheriff's deputy who specialized in delivering legal notices with appropriate documentation and discretion. Even though Mississippi law allowed landlords to serve notices personally, I wanted the delivery handled by a professional who could testify about proper service if questions arose later. That evening, I reviewed my financial situation with the same methodical attention I had given to the legal documents. Losing the rental income from Michael and Jennifer would require some adjustments to my monthly budget, but my pension and Social Security were sufficient to cover all my essential expenses. Harold had been careful about life insurance and retirement planning, leaving me financially secure enough to make decisions based on principle rather than necessity. I also calculated the potential income from renting the garage apartment to a non-family member at market rates. The amount was significantly higher than what Michael and Jennifer were paying, enough to cover the income loss and provide additional funds for house maintenance or improvements. Several of my neighbors had mentioned knowing young professionals who were looking for affordable rental properties close to downtown, people who would appreciate the character and privacy of the garage apartment without expecting family privileges or discounts. The next morning brought unexpected validation for my decision, when Jennifer called to inform me that they would be hosting a dinner party in the garage apartment over the weekend. She explained that her company was entertaining potential clients, and that she wanted to showcase the charming historic setting of our property as part of their business development strategy. The call was presented as a courtesy notification rather than a request for permission, another example of how they had come to see my property as their own. I listened politely to her plans for the dinner party, taking notes about the number of guests, the catering arrangements, and the use of my property for commercial purposes. When she finished describing the event, I thanked her for letting me know and mentioned that I would need to review the lease terms regarding business activities and guest policies. The silence on the other end of the phone suggested that she hadn't considered the legal implications of using my residential rental property for corporate entertainment. After ending the call, I added a note to the file I was building about lease violations, documenting the date and time of Jennifer's call and her plans to use my property for business purposes without seeking written permission. The dinner party would provide additional grounds for immediate lease termination if needed, but I decided to proceed with the 60-day notice as planned, rather than rushing into emergency eviction procedures. I spent Wednesday morning preparing multiple copies of all documents, ensuring that I had originals for my files, copies for my attorney, and properly formatted versions for service on the tenants. The process reminded me of the careful documentation requirements I had managed during my courthouse career, the attention to detail that prevented legal challenges and ensured successful outcomes. Every signature had to be witnessed, every date had to be accurate, every address had to match official records exactly. The process server arrived Thursday afternoon, a professional-looking man in his 50s who understood the sensitivity of serving legal documents on family members. He reviewed the paperwork carefully, verifying addresses and identification requirements, and explained exactly how the service would be documented to ensure legal compliance. We discussed timing and logistics, agreeing that the documents should be delivered during normal business hours when both tenants would likely be present. I watched from my kitchen window as he walked to the garage apartment and knocked on the door, clipboard in hand and official demeanor intact. Michael answered, still in his work clothes, looking puzzled by the unexpected visitor. The conversation was brief and polite, with the process server explaining his purpose and handing over the sealed envelope containing their legal notices. Michael signed the receipt without apparent understanding of what he was receiving, probably assuming it was some kind of routine paperwork related to property taxes or insurance. The process server returned to my front door within minutes, handing me copies of the signed receipts and confirming that service had been completed according to legal requirements. Both tenants had been present and had accepted the documents, personally, eliminating any possibility of claiming inadequate notice. The 60-day countdown to the end of their tenancy had officially begun, along with a 30-day deadline for responding to the lease violation allegations. I felt a mixture of relief and apprehension as I filed the service receipts in my growing folder of legal documents. There was no taking back this decision, no pretending that family relationships could continue unchanged after formal legal action had been initiated. But there was also no more uncertainty about my rights and options. No more feeling helpless in the face of disrespectful treatment from people who seemed to have forgotten that I was more than just an aging relative in need of management. The afternoon passed quietly, with no immediate reaction from the garage apartment, despite the fact that they had surely opened and read the legal notices by now. I wondered if they were consulting with their own attorney, or perhaps calling friends and family to complain about my unreasonable behavior. I had prepared myself for anger, accusations, and attempts to negotiate or manipulate me into changing my mind. What I hadn't expected was the silence that stretched through dinner time and into the evening. That night, I sat in Harold's study with all my legal documents spread across his desk, feeling more like myself than I had in months. The woman who had managed complex legal procedures and supervised courthouse operations was still there, still capable of protecting her own interests and demanding appropriate treatment from others. The grandmother who had been willing to accept frozen dinners and disrespectful behavior was being replaced by someone who understood that dignity isn't something you lose with age, unless you choose to give it away. I thought about the dinner party Jennifer had planned for the weekend, wondering if it would still happen now that they understood their tenancy was ending. I thought about the real estate papers they had left on my coffee table, suggestions and market analyses that seemed ridiculous in light of their current housing insecurity. Most of all, I thought about the conversation that would have to happen soon, the moment when my son would have to choose between supporting his wife's behavior and respecting his mother's rights as a property owner and human being. The legal process was in motion now, with deadlines and requirements that would proceed regardless of family dynamics or emotional appeals. But the personal process was just beginning, the reckoning that would determine whether our relationships could survive this transition or whether some kinds of disrespect create permanent damage that can't be undone with apologies or explanations. I had done everything correctly according to the law, but the harder questions about family and forgiveness and the price of demanding respect were still waiting to be answered. Friday morning arrived with the kind of electric tension that precedes a thunderstorm, when the air feels too thick and every sound seems amplified. I had barely finished my first cup of coffee when the banging started on my front door, not knocking, but pounding, the kind of frantic noise that suggests emergency or panic. Through the peephole, I could see Michael's face, flushed red and twisted with an expression I hadn't seen since he was a teenager who had just been caught breaking curfew. I opened the door slowly, maintaining my composure despite the aggressive energy radiating from my son. He held the legal documents in his clenched fist, waving them like evidence of some terrible crime I had committed against the natural order of family relationships. Jennifer stood behind him, her face pale but her eyes blazing with the kind of righteous indignation that comes from having your assumptions about power and control suddenly challenged by inconvenient legal realities. Michael pushed past me into the living room without waiting for an invitation, his voice already raised before he had fully crossed the threshold. He demanded to know what I thought I was doing, serving eviction papers on my own family like we were strangers or criminals who had somehow wronged me. He accused me of losing my mind, of being manipulated by lawyers who were taking advantage of my age and confusion to create unnecessary legal drama where simple conversation could resolve any misunderstandings. Jennifer followed with her own barrage of accusations, her carefully controlled public persona completely abandoned in favor of raw fury and disbelief. She called my actions vindictive and cruel, suggesting that I was punishing them for trying to help me manage my declining capacity to maintain my property and make reasonable decisions about my future. She insisted that everything they had done was motivated by love and concern, that any perceived slights or disrespect had been misunderstandings rather than deliberate attempts to diminish my autonomy. I listened to their tirade without interrupting, maintaining the same calm demeanor I had used during heated exchanges in courthouse conferences when emotions ran high and people forgot that legal proceedings require rational discussion rather than theatrical outbursts. When they finally paused to catch their breath, I invited them to sit down so we could discuss the situation like adults, but they remained standing, apparently believing that volume and intensity would somehow invalidate the legal documents they held in their hands. Michael's anger was particularly painful to witness because it revealed how completely he had bought into Jennifer's narrative about my diminished capacity and need for management. He spoke to me like I was a confused elderly woman who had been tricked into signing papers I didn't understand, rather than someone who had spent 4 decades working with legal documents and understood exactly what I was doing and why. His condescending tone suggested that he genuinely believed I was incapable of making informed decisions about my own property and relationships. Jennifer's approach was more calculated, shifting between wounded victim and concerned family member, who just wanted what was best for everyone involved. She reminded me of all the ways they had tried to help me, from researching retirement communities to bringing healthy meals to coordinating with real estate professionals who could help me maximize my property value. She painted their behavior as selfless assistance that I was now repaying with legal aggression and family betrayal. I finally spoke when they had exhausted their initial fury, my voice steady and clear despite the emotional hurricane swirling around my living room. I explained that the legal notices were not punishments or acts of revenge, but simple business decisions based on the lease agreement they had signed and the tenant obligations they had violated. I enumerated their breaches of contract, from unauthorized commercial activities to accessing areas of my property that weren't included in their rental agreement. Michael interrupted to argue that family members shouldn't have to follow the same rules as strangers, that love and blood relationships should take precedence over technical legal requirements. He seemed genuinely confused by my insistence on treating our landlord-tenant arrangement as a real contract with enforceable terms, as if family membership automatically exempted them from normal standards of respect and compliance. I responded by asking whether being family members exempted me from normal standards of dignity and consideration, whether my age and relationship to them meant I should accept frozen dinners while they enjoyed fresh meals, or tolerate having my home treated like their personal renovation project without my consent. The question seemed to catch them off guard, as if they had never considered that their behavior toward me might be subject to the same ethical standards they expected from others. Jennifer quickly pivoted to arguing that the frozen dinner had been a thoughtful accommodation of my dietary needs and limitations, that she had researched senior-friendly meal options specifically to help me maintain proper nutrition without the burden of cooking elaborate meals. She made it sound like a medical intervention rather than the insulting dismissal it had actually been, wrapping her disrespect in the language of care and concern. I pulled out my own copy of their lease agreement and began reading aloud the specific clauses they had violated, my courthouse training serving me well as I navigated the legal language and identified the relevant sections. The document was clear and unambiguous about guest policies, commercial activities, and access to common areas, leaving little room for interpretation or excuses about family exemptions. Michael demanded to know why I hadn't simply talked to them about any concerns instead of immediately resorting to legal action, conveniently forgetting the months of conversations where I had expressed my preferences about my home and my life, only to be dismissed or ignored. I reminded him of the numerous times I had declined their suggestions about selling my house, updating my living arrangements, and accepting their management of my daily routines. Jennifer accused me of being stubborn and unreasonable, of rejecting help that any sensible person would appreciate and embrace. She listed all the research she had done on my behalf, all the time and energy she had invested in finding solutions to problems I didn't even realize I had. Her generosity in managing my life was supposed to earn her gratitude and compliance, not legal challenges and eviction notices. The conversation devolved into a circular argument about respect, family, obligations, and the difference between helping someone and controlling them. Michael and Jennifer seemed genuinely unable to understand that their good intentions didn't excuse their dismissive behavior, that wanting to help me didn't give them the right to override my decisions about my own life and property. I finally ended the discussion by explaining that the legal process was already in motion, and would proceed according to the timelines specified in Mississippi law. They had 60 days to find alternative housing arrangements, during which time they could remain in the garage apartment as long as they complied with all lease terms and discontinued any unauthorized activities. I offered to provide references for their rental applications and wished them well in finding a new home that better suited their needs. The silence that followed my statement was profound and uncomfortable, filled with the kind of shocked disbelief that comes when people realize their assumptions about power and control have been fundamentally wrong. Michael stared at me like I had become a stranger, someone whose behavior he couldn't predict or understand. Jennifer's carefully maintained composure finally cracked completely, revealing the raw anger and entitlement that had been driving her campaign to manage my life. They left without saying goodbye, slamming the front door hard enough to rattle the windows and walking back to the garage apartment with rigid, furious postures that spoke louder than any words. I watched them from my kitchen window, noting the way they gestured angrily at each other and glanced back at my house like it had somehow betrayed them by refusing to cooperate with their plans. The rest of Friday passed in blessed silence, broken only by the occasional sound of car doors slamming and muffled conversations from the direction of the garage apartment. I assumed they were making phone calls, probably to family members and friends who would be asked to validate their version of events and condemn my unreasonable behavior. I felt no urge to defend myself or explain my position to people who hadn't witnessed the months of escalating disrespect. Saturday brought the dinner party Jennifer had planned, despite the legal notices and the obvious strain in our family relationships. I watched from my bedroom window as catering trucks arrived and professional servers began setting up tables and decorations in the space behind the garage apartment. The irony wasn't lost on me that she was proceeding with a commercial event on my property, even after being formally notified that such activities violated her lease agreement. The guests began arriving around 6 in the evening, well-dressed business people who parked their expensive cars along my driveway and walked past my house without acknowledgement or greeting. I recognized some faces from Jennifer's social media posts, colleagues, and clients who represented the sophisticated lifestyle she was so eager to project. The party was clearly intended to showcase her taste and hospitality, using my property as a backdrop for her professional networking. I documented everything from my window, taking photographs of the commercial catering setup, the business vehicles, and the obvious violation of residential lease terms that was playing out in my backyard. The evidence would strengthen my legal position if they chose to contest the eviction, but more importantly, it demonstrated their complete disregard for the boundaries and agreements that governed their tenancy. The laughter and conversation from the party drifted across the yard, along with the clink of glasses and the professional bustle of servers managing an elaborate meal. I thought about the contrast between their elegant gathering and the frozen dinner they had considered appropriate for me, the difference between how they treated people they wanted to impress and how they treated family members they had decided to manage. Around 10 o'clock, I heard a knock on my back door, softer than Michael's morning assault, but still insistent enough to command attention. I opened it to find Jennifer standing alone, her party dress slightly wrinkled and her carefully applied makeup showing signs of stress and fatigue. She asked if we could talk privately, away from the guests and Michael, woman to woman about the situation that was tearing our family apart. I invited her into my kitchen, curious about what approach she would take without Michael's emotional support and righteous anger. She sat at my table like a deflated balloon, her earlier fury replaced by something that looked almost like genuine vulnerability. She apologized for the way things had escalated, admitting that maybe they had been too aggressive in trying to help me transition to a more manageable living situation. Jennifer explained that her motivations had been pure, that watching me struggle with the demands of maintaining such a large property had genuinely worried her about my safety and well-being. She painted a picture of herself as someone who cared too much, who had overstepped boundaries out of love rather than any desire to control or manipulate me. The performance was convincing, but I had seen too many manipulative defendants in courthouse hearings to be swayed by tears and apologies. that conveniently appeared after legal consequences had been established. I listened politely to her explanation and apology, then asked her to explain why she had proceeded with tonight's dinner party after being formally notified that commercial activities violated her lease agreement. The question seemed to surprise her, as if she had expected our conversation to focus on emotions and family relationships rather than concrete legal violations that were still occurring. Her answer revealed everything I needed to know about how seriously she took the legal process and my rights as a property owner. She explained that the party had been planned for months, that canceling would have damaged important business relationships and cost her company valuable opportunities. My lease violations and eviction notices were inconvenient obstacles to be managed or dismissed, not legitimate legal concerns that required immediate compliance. I thanked her for her honesty and explained that our conversation had provided additional documentation of willful lease violations that would support expedited eviction proceedings if necessary. The shock on her face suggested that she had expected our private talk to result in some kind of emotional reconciliation that would override the legal process, that feminine solidarity would trump property rights and contractual obligations. Jennifer left my kitchen with the same rigid anger she had displayed earlier, any pretense of vulnerability or remorse abandoned in favor of cold fury. The party continued for another hour before guests began departing, their voices and laughter gradually fading as expensive cars pulled out of my driveway and disappeared into the Mississippi night. Sunday morning brought unprecedented quiet. From the garage apartment, no movement or conversation to suggest that my tenants were even present. I wondered if they had left town to stay with friends or family while they figured out their next move, or if they were simply avoiding any contact that might lead to additional legal complications. Either way, the silence was a relief after months of feeling constantly observed and evaluated in my own home. The week ahead would bring deadlines and decisions, attorney consultations, and documentation requirements that would determine how quickly and smoothly the eviction process would proceed. But for now, I was content to sit in my kitchen with my morning coffee, looking out at my garden and feeling like the owner of my own life for the first time in months. The 30 days that followed moved with the steady inevitability of a Mississippi river during spring flood, carrying away everything that wasn't built on solid ground. Michael and Jennifer had initially responded to the eviction proceedings with lawyers and appeals, filing motions that challenged my mental competency and questioned whether family members could legally evict each other under standard landlord-tenant law. Their attorney was young and inexperienced, clearly chosen more for his willingness to take their case than for any expertise in property law or family legal disputes. James Crawford handled their legal challenges with the kind of professional competence I remembered from my courthouse days, methodically dismantling every argument with citations and precedents that left little room for appeal. The lease agreement was ironclad. My mental capacity was well documented through recent medical records and financial statements, and the violations were clearly established through photographs and witness testimony. Their lawyers quickly discovered that Mississippi courts don't recognize family sentiment as grounds for voiding legally binding contracts. The most satisfying moment came when Jennifer's dinner party photographs appeared as evidence in court filings, her own social media posts documenting the commercial use of my residential property in clear violation of lease terms. She had tagged her company and identified business associates in the images, creating an undeniable record of exactly the kind of prohibited activity that justified immediate termination of tenancy. Her attempt to showcase her lifestyle had become proof of her legal violations. Michael made one final attempt at emotional manipulation, arriving at my door on a rainy Tuesday afternoon with tears in his eyes and apologies in his voice. He begged me to reconsider the eviction, promising that Jennifer would change her behavior and respect my boundaries if I would just give them another chance. He painted a picture of homelessness and family destruction, suggesting that I was destroying his marriage and his future over minor misunderstandings that could easily be resolved through better communication. I listened to his plea with the same patience I had shown difficult courthouse visitors who couldn't understand why. Their legal problems required legal solutions rather than emotional appeals. When he finished his speech, I reminded him that this wasn't about punishment or revenge, but about establishing basic standards of respect that should have existed without legal enforcement. I explained that some violations of trust and dignity create permanent changes in relationships, that some lines once crossed can't be uncrossed through apologies and promises. Michael left that afternoon with slumped shoulders and defeated posture, finally understanding that his mother wasn't the confused elderly woman he and Jennifer had tried to manage and control. I felt sadness watching him walk away, but no regret about the boundaries I had established. Love without respect isn't really love at all, and family relationships that require you to diminish yourself aren't worth preserving at any cost. The eviction proceeded exactly according to the legal timeline, with deputies arriving on the specified date to ensure that my former tenants vacated the property completely and without incident. Michael and Jennifer had already moved most of their belongings during the preceding week, hiring professional movers who worked quickly and efficiently to pack up 3 years of accumulated possessions. They left the garage apartment clean and undamaged, perhaps hoping that responsible behavior at the end might somehow redeem their earlier violations. I watched the final moving truck pull out of my driveway from my kitchen window, feeling a complex mixture of relief and melancholy that comes with the end of any significant chapter in your life. The garage apartment sat empty and quiet, ready to be rented to tenants who would appreciate the opportunity and respect the boundaries that came with it. Within a week, I had 3 qualified applicants, young professionals who understood that renting property meant following lease terms and treating landlords with basic courtesy. The new tenant I selected was a nurse practitioner named David who worked at the regional medical center and appreciated the quiet, private setting of the garage apartment. He signed his lease agreement without trying to negotiate special terms or family discounts, paid his security deposit without complaint, and introduced himself to me with the kind of respectful professionalism that had been missing from my recent family interactions. His rent payments arrived promptly each month, along with occasional notes thanking me for maintaining such a pleasant living environment. 6 months after the eviction, I received a wedding invitation in the mail, forwarded from an address I didn't recognize in another state. Michael and Jennifer were remarrying each other in what appeared to be a destination ceremony in Colorado, far from the Mississippi community where their first attempt at family manipulation had failed so spectacularly. The invitation was formal and impersonal, the kind you send to distant relatives you feel obligated to include, but don't expect to attend. I sent a tasteful wedding gift purchased online and delivered to their new address, along with a polite note wishing them happiness in their fresh start. There was no malice in the gesture, but no invitation for renewed contact either. Some relationships survive major conflicts and emerge stronger, while others reveal fundamental incompatibilities that make future connection impossible. Ours had clearly fallen into the second category. The real transformation came in how I began to see myself and my place in the world. The months of being treated like someone whose opinions and preferences didn't matter had gradually convinced me that maybe I really was becoming irrelevant. That age automatically meant diminished capacity and reduced rights. Fighting back through legal channels had reminded me that competence and dignity aren't age-related privileges that disappear on schedule, but qualities that persist as long as you're willing to defend them. I started saying no more often to requests and suggestions that didn't align with my values or preferences, whether they came from family members, service providers, or well-meaning friends who thought they knew what was best for someone my age. I discovered that most people respected clear boundaries more than they resented them, that being direct about your expectations often improved relationships rather than damaging them. The house felt different too, no longer a burden that required constant justification, but a source of pride and independence that I had earned through decades of careful financial management and responsible ownership. I made improvements because I wanted them, not because someone else thought they were necessary. I entertained guests who appreciated my hospitality rather than criticized my choices. I cooked meals that pleased me rather than accommodating dietary restrictions and preferences that turned food into a source of stress rather than joy. My social circle expanded to include people who shared my interests and values, rather than those who felt obligated to manage my declining years. I joined a book club at the library, volunteered at the local historical society, and reconnected with friends I had neglected during the months of family drama. These relationships were based on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than duty or concern about my capacity to function independently. The legal victory had been important, but the personal transformation was life-changing. I had rediscovered the strong, competent woman who had managed complex professional responsibilities and raised a family and maintained a household through decades of challenge and change. That woman hadn't disappeared with age. She had simply been buried under other people's assumptions about what elderly people could and couldn't handle. On quiet evenings, I sometimes sat in Harold's study with the legal documents that had changed everything spread across his desk, remembering the night when I had discovered the lease agreement and realized that I had more power than anyone had given me credit for. The eviction papers had been about property law and tenant rights, but they had really been about reclaiming my voice and my agency in relationships that had become dangerously one-sided. The story spread through our community in the way that dramatic family conflicts always do, with neighbors and acquaintances taking sides and offering opinions about whether I had been justified in evicting my own son. Most people seem to understand that respect and dignity transcend family relationships, that being someone's mother doesn't obligate you to accept poor treatment indefinitely. A few thought I had been harsh and unforgiving, but their disapproval carried no weight because they hadn't lived through months of systematic dismissal and disrespect. The garage apartment continued to provide steady rental income that supplemented my pension and Social Security, allowing me to maintain my independence without financial stress or pressure to downsize. David proved to be an ideal tenant, quiet, and responsible and appreciative of the living situation I provided. Our relationship was friendly but professional, based on clearly understood expectations and mutual respect for boundaries. 2 years later, I received a Christmas card from Michael and Jennifer, postmarked from their new home in Denver, where they had apparently established a successful life far from the scene of their Mississippi defeat. The card included a photo of them with a baby girl, along with a brief note mentioning that they were doing well and hoped I was healthy and happy. There was no apology or acknowledgement of what had happened between us, but no hostility either, just the kind of distant politeness that develops between people who have decided to coexist peacefully from a safe distance. I added their card to my collection of holiday greetings and felt nothing more than mild curiosity about how their lives were unfolding. The intense emotions of our conflict had faded into acceptance and indifference, the way most dramatic events eventually lose their power to affect your daily happiness. They had chosen their path. I had chosen mine. And we were all better off living according to our authentic values rather than maintaining relationships that required constant compromise and accommodation. The lesson I carried forward from that experience was simple but profound. Dignity and respect aren't gifts that other people give you, but standards you establish and maintain for yourself. Age might change your body and your circumstances, but it doesn't automatically diminish your right to be treated with consideration and courtesy. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for difficult people is to establish clear consequences for their behavior, teaching them through experience what they failed to learn through conversation. My life in the years that followed was quieter, but more satisfying, built on relationships and activities that honored my choices and preferences, rather than trying to manage or improve them. The house that had once been a source of conflict became a symbol of independence and strength, proof that some things are worth fighting for even when the cost includes relationships you had hoped to preserve. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.